What you're about to discover goes beyond any horror movie you've ever watched, because the reality behind some of the scariest characters in cinema was born from an isolated farm in the American interior, where an ordinary man kept secrets so disturbing that even experienced investigators left the crime scene vomiting and requesting transfers. And understanding this story will completely change how you see the thin line between sanity and madness. It all started on a cold November afternoon when a woman simply disappeared. Bernice Warden owned a hardware store in a small town, one of those places where everyone knows everyone, where doors stay open and trust still exists. But that Saturday she didn't close the store, didn't go home, didn't call anyone. She simply evaporated, leaving behind only the open cash register and a bloodstain on the wooden floor. Her son, who worked as a sheriff, knew something was terribly wrong, and when he started investigating, the last name written in the sales ledger was of a customer who had bought antifreeze that morning. The name was Ed Gein, a solitary farmer who lived on the outskirts of town, known for being odd but harmless, always wearing worn clothes and speaking little when he came to the village. When police arrived at that decaying farm at dusk, nothing could have prepared those men for what they would find inside that house. The back door was unlocked, and upon entering with flashlights because there was no working electricity, the first thing they saw hanging in the shed was Bernice Warden's decapitated body, hanging upside down, as if it were an animal slaughtered for consumption. But that was just the beginning of a discovery that would become one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. As they advanced through the dark and stinking house, investigators found a collection of horrors that defied any normal human comprehension. Lampshades made with human skin, stretched over wire frames. Chairs decorated with artisanally tanned human leather. A shoebox full of preserved facial masks created with entire faces carefully removed from corpses, with hair still intact. Sawed skulls, transformed into bowls. A vest made entirely of female torso, with breasts included, that could be worn like clothing. These were physical evidence of a mind so deeply disturbed that even experienced psychiatrists would have difficulty fully comprehending it. And when they arrested Ed Gein and began interrogating him, the pieces of a macabre puzzle began to fall into place. He had not only killed Bernice Warden and another woman years before, but had spent years desecrating graves in local cemeteries, digging up recently buried bodies of women who resembled someone very specific. His mother. His mother. And that's precisely where the story gets even darker. Because to understand the monster, you need to understand the upbringing. Ed Gein grew up on an isolated farm under the absolute control of a religious fanatic mother who preached that all women, except herself, were vessels of sin and corruption. Augusta Gein was a domineering and abusive figure who raised her two sons in total social isolation, forbidding friendships, condemning any interaction with the outside world as demonic influence. She read the Bible obsessively, focusing especially on passages about death, punishment and fornication, hammering into the boys' heads that the world out there was a place of perdition and that only under her roof would there be salvation. The father was a failed alcoholic whom she openly despised, and the sons grew up witnessing this toxic marriage where contempt was the only constant emotion. When Ed's older brother died under suspicious circumstances during a fire on the property, many speculated that Ed himself might have been involved, especially because the body was found in an area not affected by fire and with signs of head trauma, but nothing was proven at the time. What is known for certain is that after his brother's death, Ed was left alone with his mother, and her obsession with him and his with her intensified to sickening levels. When Augusta finally died after a series of strokes, Ed was 40 years old and had never had a girlfriend, a kiss, not even an intimate conversation with any woman other than his mother, and instead of feeling liberation, he plunged into a psychological abyss from which he would never emerge. He sealed her room exactly as it was on the day of her death, preserving that space as an untouchable sanctuary. He began living only in a small part of the house, letting the rest rot in compulsive accumulation and filth. And it was during this period of pathological mourning that things really went off the rails. Ed began reading about anatomy, about Nazism, about medical experiments, about cannibalism. He became especially interested in articles about sex change, which at the time was scientific novelty, and in his fragmented mental state, developed a bizarre fantasy of becoming a woman, not through surgery, but literally by wearing dead women. That's when the nightly expeditions to cemeteries began. He studied obituaries in local newspapers, memorized which middle-aged women had been recently buried, waited for the new moon to have total darkness, and went with his pickup truck to dig them up. At first he just took entire bodies home, but over time developed more specific techniques, removing only the parts that interested him. He tanned the skin, preserved organs, studied anatomy with a mixture of scientific curiosity and repressed sexual obsession. And from time to time, on lonely nights at that farm, far from everything, he wore vests made of human skin put on facial masks, and danced alone by candlelight under the moon, trying somehow in a sick way to transform himself or reunite with the maternal figure who had simultaneously loved and destroyed him. But cemetery bodies eventually weren't enough. He wanted something fresher, more alive, more real, and that's when he killed, for the first time. Mary Hogan, a bar owner, disappeared in 1954, and nobody connected her disappearance to Ed at the time. 3 years later came Bernice Warden, and this time he made mistakes. Left evidence was seen near the store, and when he was finally discovered, the small town of Plainfield went into collective shock. The people Ed had lived with his entire life, who thought he was just shy and strange, suddenly discovered they had been close to a predator whose mind inhabited regions of darkness that most people can't even imagine. During interrogations, Ed spoke about the crimes with disconcerting calmness, sometimes seeming genuinely confused about why that was considered wrong. He didn't understand he had done anything beyond normal, because for him, whose norm had been established by years of maternal psychological abuse and total isolation, those actions made sense within his fragmented internal logic. When subjected to psychiatric evaluations, the diagnosis came quick and definitive. Severe schizophrenia, unable to distinguish reality from fantasy, absolutely unfit to answer for his crimes in court. He was sent to a maximum security psychiatric hospital, where he would spend the rest of his life and never faced a formal criminal trial for the atrocities he committed. But here's the most disturbing aspect of this whole story. Ed Gein didn't die in obscurity. His farm was burned by outraged residents who didn't want it to become a morbid attraction. But his story spread, and Hollywood realized it had found something frighteningly rich to exploit. Just 2 years after his arrest, the book about the case inspired Robert Bloch to write Psych, which Alfred Hitchcock transformed into the film that redefined psychological terror in cinema. Norman Bates, the motel owner with a dead but still domineering mother, came directly from Ed Gein's case files. Years later, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre took the elements of rural isolation, decoration made from human remains, and dysfunctional family to create And then came The Silence of the Lambs, where Buffalo Bill sews human skin, trying to make a female suit, in a direct reference to the vests and masks found at that farm. 3 of the most iconic villains in horror cinema were born from a single real man. And this raises deeply uncomfortable questions. Why does Ed Gein's story resonate so much? Why does Hollywood repeatedly return to this well of horror for inspiration? Perhaps because deep down, in a perverse way, his story touches on universal fears. The fear that seemingly normal people hide monstrosities. The fear that familial love can transform into something destructive. The fear that there exists a darkness in the human psyche that no society can control or predict. Ed Gein died in 1984 in a psychiatric institution at 77 years old, having spent more than half his life he never expressed genuine remorse, never really understood the magnitude of what he had done, because his mind simply didn't function within normal parameters of morality or empathy. And perhaps that's the scariest part. He wasn't a calculating evil genius, wasn't a manipulative psychopath, like the ones Hollywood likes to portray. He was just a man profoundly broken by abuse, isolation and mental illness, whose destructive impulses were left unchecked until they exploded in unimaginable ways. The whole story serves as a brutal reminder that monsters aren't born in vacuums. They're created through toxic combinations of trauma, disease, and circumstance. And it also serves as a warning that the line between social functionality and psychological collapse can be much thinner than we'd like to believe. If you're thinking you'd never know someone like that you'd know how to identify a predator, remember that Ed Gein's neighbors lived with him for decades without suspecting anything, because he was quiet, polite, paid his bills, and didn't cause visible problems. The true horror was happening behind closed doors, in a mind nobody could access, until it was too late. If this story impacted you, if you want to continue exploring these cases that reveal the darkest corners of human psychology, subscribe here to the Archive Mind, because we go deep into these files that most prefer not to open. Hit the bell, share this video with someone who's into real true crime, and leave in the comments which case you want us to explore next. There's much more disturbing history waiting to be told.